He owned Chicago, the courts, the docks, the silence between gunshots at 3 a.m. Ronan Vale had built his empire on one simple truth: weakness invited destruction. So when a trembling woman in a department store dress stumbled into him and soaked his $20,000 suit in champagne, he didn't think. He performed. In front of 400 witnesses, he dismantled her completely. Her clothes, her hands, the way she breathed. He made her small because he could. Because nobody in that ballroom would stop him. He was wrong about one thing. He was wrong about her. Before this story goes any further, if you're already hooked, hit that like button and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The night Chicago swallowed Ronan Vale whole began the way most catastrophic nights begin, quietly and with excellent lighting. The Harbor Legacy Gala occupied the entire fourth floor of the Meridian Grand, a limestone building that rose above Lake Michigan like a monument to money that had long forgotten where it came from. The event raised funds for children's hospitals, or so the invitation claimed. What it actually raised was visibility, for politicians who needed photographs with philanthropists, for developers who needed introductions to judges, and for men like Ronan Vale, who needed the world to keep believing he was something other than what he was. He stood near the far window with a glass of scotch he hadn't touched, watching the room with the particular kind of stillness that made people instinctively look away. At 32, Ronan Vale was what happened when ambition had no ceiling and no conscience to slow it down. 6'1", dark-haired, jaw set like concrete, with eyes the color of winter water, gray and very cold. He wore a charcoal Brioni suit that had been tailored to the exact architecture of his body, every seam deliberate. He looked like a CEO, because he needed to look like a CEO. Underneath the suit, underneath the investment portfolio and the logistics empire and the charitable donations, he was the man who controlled every criminal operation between Milwaukee, Ogden, and St. Louis, and everyone in this room who mattered knew it. They smiled at him anyway. That was Chicago. Marcus Hale materialized at his left elbow. Marcus had been Ronan's intelligence chief for 6 years, a compact man with a forgettable face and an extraordinary memory, which made him the most valuable person in the room and the least likely to be noticed. He spoke without turning his head. Alderman Purcell needs a word about the port zoning. Tell him I already know what he needs and he can call the office Monday. He won't like that. He likes his banking license. Tell him Monday. Marcus faded back. Ronan lifted the scotch, didn't drink it, set it back on the tray of a passing server without looking. Across the room, a cluster of women in floor-length gowns laughed at something a gray-haired senator said. The senator looked enormously pleased with himself. The women looked like they were being paid to find him funny, which, in various indirect ways, most of them were. Ronan moved through the room with the efficiency of a man who had mastered the performance of belonging. He shook hands. He listened to 3 sentences of whatever concern each person presented before redirecting the conversation towards something he controlled. He smiled precisely as often as required and not once more. Beside him, his personal security, 2 men named Decker and Cole, who wore their suits like they were uncomfortable in any fabric that wasn't Kevlar, kept a loose perimeter without making it visible. He had almost completed his necessary circuit of the room when the collision happened. She came from his left, angling between 2 groups of guests with her eyes cast slightly down and both hands occupied. One holding a small clutch purse, the other balancing a flute of champagne she'd clearly just taken from a server's tray. She was moving fast because someone behind her was moving faster. A woman, brunette, expensive dress, the particular aggressive volume of someone 4 drinks deep, shoved past the crowd and hit her squarely in the shoulder. The champagne went airborne. Ronan felt the cold shock of it across his chest and forearm before he fully registered what had happened. The liquid spread across the charcoal fabric in a dark, spreading map. The glass hit the floor and shattered. The sound, thin, clean, decisive, cut through the ambient noise of the ballroom and drew every set of eyes within 30 feet. The woman who'd been carrying the glass froze. She was not what he'd expected. Not that he'd had time to form an expectation. She was young, mid-20s maybe, with dark hair pinned back in a way that looked functional rather than styled, a dress that was modest and green and clearly not from the same universe as the gowns surrounding her. Her shoes were flat. She had the hands of someone who worked with them. Not rough, but real, with no rings and short nails and a steadiness to them even now, even as she stood in the wreckage of the spilled glass and faced him. Her eyes were dark brown. She was looking at him with an expression that was not quite an apology, not quite panic, something more careful than either. She started. Don't, he said. The word came out flat and immediate, the way he spoke when he wasn't performing anymore. The crowd around them had gone quiet in the practiced way of people who understand they are about to witness something. Ronan looked down at the ruin of his suit. The champagne was still spreading. He looked back up at her, and something happened to his face that the people who knew him recognized. The slight tightening around the jaw, the way his expression went from neutral to something with edges. You have any idea what you just did? It wasn't. There was someone who pushed. I'm not asking for an explanation. His voice was very controlled and very loud, the kind of loud that doesn't need to shout. I'm asking if you understand that this suit costs more than whatever you make in 3 months. She went very still. The brunette who had actually caused the collision had already dissolved back into the crowd. Nobody stopped her. Nobody said anything. The room watched Ronan Vale the way you watch an approaching storm, with the understanding that the correct response is to be somewhere else, and the unfortunate reality that you're not. I understand, she said quietly. I don't think you do. He looked at her the way he looked at balance sheets that didn't add up, with a clinical, detached contempt. Who invited you? You're not a guest. You're staff. He glanced at her shoes, then back up, letting the pause do the work. No, not even staff. What are you, a +1? Whose? Color rose in her face. Not shame, exactly. Something harder than shame, but she swallowed it. I was invited, she said. By who? That's not relevant. Lady. The word came out like a dismissal. In this room, everything is relevant when I ask it. You just destroyed a Brioni suit that I will now have to... I didn't destroy anything. Her voice was still quiet, but something in it had changed. I was bumped. By someone. Not by choice. Are you arguing with me? I'm correcting a factual inaccuracy. Someone nearby inhaled sharply. Ronan heard it. He registered the shift in the room's atmosphere the way you register a change in air pressure. He looked at her, really looked, for the first time, and found someone looking back at him with dark eyes that were not frightened, careful, controlled, but not frightened. That, inexplicably, made it worse. Do you know who I am? He asked. Yes, she said. Then you understand that correcting me in public is not something most people do twice. I understand you think that. The silence that followed was the kind that had weight. Ronan was aware of 400 people watching him manage this moment, and the particular arithmetic of power that required he demonstrate, in the next 30 seconds, that interrupting his evening carried consequences. He leaned in slightly. Not threatening, worse than threatening, clinical. You walked in here in a dress from a department store, he said, low enough that only she and the nearest 6 people could hear it. Your shoes are from a chain. Your bag costs less than the serving trays. You don't belong here, and you know it, and whoever told you that you could walk into a room like this and be treated like everyone else was lying to you. He straightened. Security. Decker materialized at his shoulder. Escort her out. The color left her face. Not in the way of someone who is humiliated, in the way of someone who is choosing how to respond to humiliation, which is a different thing entirely. She looked at Ronan for a long moment. 3 seconds. 4. Then she picked up her small clutch from the floor. She dropped it when the glass shattered. With a steadiness that was almost unnerving, and she turned toward the exit. Decker moved to flank her. She paused. Not dramatically. Not for effect. She simply stopped walking, half turned, and looked back at Ronan across the distance that had opened between them. Her face was very composed. You think you're a king, she said. Her voice carried just far enough. Just far enough for the nearest cluster of guests to hear it. Just far enough to ensure it was not a private moment. But real kings know the monsters hiding in the dark. Then she left. The room held its breath for exactly 2 seconds. Then the ambient sound of conversation and music and ice in glasses returned, because this was Chicago, and this was the Harbor Legacy Gala, and whatever had just happened, the correct response was to pretend you hadn't seen it. Ronan stood with champagne drying cold on his chest and watched the door close behind her. He felt, and this was the part he would not be able to explain later, not to Marcus, not to himself, nothing. Which was wrong. He should have felt the satisfaction of having maintained order. Instead, he felt a faint, sourceless unease, the way you feel when you've moved a chess piece and can't immediately identify why it was the wrong move. He handed his untouched glass to a passing server. "Find out who she was," he told Decker. Then he went back to his obligations. The gala went on for another hour and 40 minutes. Ronan made the rounds twice more. He had 3 conversations that mattered and 8 that were necessary. He accepted a check for the Children's Hospital on behalf of Vail Meridian Logistics and posed for 2 photographs. He did all of this with the practiced fluency of a man who had built a double life so airtight that he sometimes forgot which version was the performance. It was not until he was in the car, a black Escalade with tinted glass and a partition between him and the driver, that Decker appeared in the rear-view feed on the console screen. "The woman from the gala," Decker said. "Tell me." There was a pause. Decker was not a man who paused. He paused now. "Her name is Serafina Moretti." Ronan looked at the screen. "Say that again." "Serafina Moretti. She goes by Ashcroft, her mother's maiden name. She's been using it since she left New York 5 years ago. Lives in Chicago's Lincoln Square neighborhood. Works at a bookstore. Independent shop, Clarion Books. 3 employees." Another pause. "She's Vittorio Moretti's granddaughter." The silence in the back of the Escalade was absolute. Ronan Vail knew the name Vittorio Moretti the way every man in his world knew it, the way you know the name of a geological fault line. Not because you've seen it, but because you've felt what it can do. Don Vittorio Moretti was 81 years old and had been the most powerful patriarch in American organized crime for 4 decades. The Moretti family operated across 9 states, had influence in federal contracting, Port Authority, half the East Coast judiciary, and enough offshore accounts to destabilize a small nation's currency if someone were stupid enough to press the issue. They did not make threats. Threats were a negotiation. When the Moretti family decided something was a problem, the problem simply ceased to exist. "She's the heir," Decker said. "Direct line, sole grandchild. The old man has kept her out of it. She walked away from the family 5 years ago, wanted nothing to do with it. But the protection detail, the men watching the gala tonight, they were Moretti soldiers, 4 of them. They watched everything." "Everything," Ronan repeated, every word, every second of it. Ronan put his head back against the seat. Outside, Chicago moved past the darkened windows. The lakefront, the lights, the ordinary machinery of a city that had no idea how thin the ice under it was at any given moment. He had publicly humiliated the sole heir of the most dangerous family in America. He had done it in front of 400 witnesses and her grandfather's protection detail. He had done it because she'd spilled a drink. He stayed very still for a long time. "Get me Marcus," he said. Marcus was already on the call within 40 seconds. Ronan gave him the information in 3 sentences. The line was silent for a moment. "How bad is it?" Ronan asked. "Define bad," Marcus said. "Don't do that. The East Coast alliances, the 3 families we've been negotiating transit rights with for the last 18 months, all 3 of them are either directly in the Moretti orbit or dependent on Moretti approval to operate. If Vittorio decides to make this a formal grievance, he will. Then yes, bad is one word for it." Marcus's voice was careful and absolutely controlled. "We need to move tonight. How much time do we have?" "I don't know. The detail reported to him directly. It's already in his hands." "Then we move now. Tonight." The Escalade turned north. Ronan was already on his second call before they crossed the river. He did not sleep that night. He ran the numbers instead. Not the financial kind, though those mattered. The political kind. The 3 East Coast families. Their dependency structures. The shipments currently in transit through Chicago's port that moved under Vail Meridian Logistics contracts, which were the legitimate face of 12 separate criminal revenue streams. The 14 alliances he'd spent 7 years building across the Midwest. The architecture of his power, which had felt Until approximately 90 minutes ago, like something approaching permanent. All of it balanced on the question of how an 81-year-old man in New York had decided to respond to what had happened in a hotel ballroom on the shores of Lake Michigan. And somewhere beneath the calculation, quieter than the numbers, was the image of her face, the way she had stopped at the door and looked back at him, the specific quality of her stillness, the fact that she hadn't begged, the fact that she hadn't cried, the fact that she'd said what she said and then simply walked out, as though she already knew how this ended and had decided to let him figure it out on his own. He was at his desk by 4 in the morning. By 6, Marcus had confirmed what Ronan had already suspected. The 3 East Coast families had gone quiet. Not hostile, quiet. Which in this world was often worse. Hostile was an announcement. Quiet was a door being closed. By 9, 2 of his standing contracts had been placed under administrative review by parties who had not reviewed anything administratively in 7 years. By 11, Marcus walked into his office and said, "We have a location on her." Ronan looked up. "She opened the store this morning, Clarion Books, 40 minutes from here." Ronan had spent the night constructing a dozen approaches to this situation. Legal maneuvers, financial pressure, diplomatic channels, intermediaries who could open conversations with the Moretti family without exposing him directly. He had ranked them by probability of success and risk of escalation. He had been logical and methodical and exactly the kind of strategist his empire required. He stood up and got his coat. "I'll go myself," he said. Marcus said nothing, which was how Marcus expressed that he thought something was a mistake. "Say it," Ronan said. "You going there personally signals either desperation or contrition." "It is contrition. That's not something you do." "I know." He pulled the coat on. "That's why it's the only thing she'll believe." The drive to Lincoln Square took 43 minutes in morning traffic. Ronan sat in the back of the Escalade with his phone in his hand and did not look at it. He watched the city change around him, the downtown architecture giving way to neighborhoods, glass and steel softening into brick and trees, and storefronts that had been there long enough to develop character. Clarion Books occupied the ground floor of a narrow building on a tree-lined street. Hand-painted sign, small front window with a thoughtfully arranged display of new arrivals. The kind of store that existed because someone loved books more than they cared about profit margins. Decker pulled to the curb. Cole stayed in the car. Ronan stood on the sidewalk for a moment and looked at the door. He had walked into a lot of rooms in his life. He had walked into rooms knowing people inside wanted him dead, and he had done it with his hands still and his face controlled and his pulse at an acceptable 68 beats per minute. He was not afraid of rooms. He pushed the door open. A small bell announced him. The smell of the place hit him immediately, paper and wood and something faintly warm, coffee, maybe, from somewhere in the back. The shelves were floor to ceiling and organized in a way that suggested an actual system rather than the impression of one. There were 3 customers visible, a man with a paperback in the corner, 2 women consulting about something in the history section. Behind the counter, she was there. She wore a gray sweater and had her hair down now, and she was making a handwritten note on an order form without looking up. And she had the particular quality of focus of someone who finds a task genuinely interesting rather than merely necessary. She looked, in that moment, nothing at all like the woman who had stood at the ballroom door and delivered a 7-word sentence that had dismantled his confidence. She looked like someone who worked at a bookstore. She looked up. The pen stopped moving. Their eyes met across the length of the store, and Ronan watched her face cycle through recognition and then something more complicated. Not fear, he was almost certain now that fear wasn't in her vocabulary where he was concerned, something controlled and deliberate. She set the pen down. She waited. Ronan walked to the counter. He had prepared something to say. He had rehearsed it, which was not something he typically needed to do. He looked at her across the wooden counter and said none of it. "I owe you an apology," he said. Her expression did not change. "I behaved inexcusably last night. What I said, the way I spoke to you, was wrong. The circumstances were irrelevant. There is no version of what happened where my behavior is defensible." She looked at him for a long moment. "No," she said, "there isn't. I'm asking for the opportunity to repair it." Why? The directness of it caught him. He had expected negotiation, demands, the leverage she held over him being applied with the particular expertise of someone who grew up watching leverage applied. "Because I was wrong," he said. "You were wrong last night, too. You weren't apologizing last night." He held eye contact. "No, I wasn't." "So what changed?" And there it was. The question he had been hoping she wouldn't ask, because there was only one honest answer, and the honest answer was exactly what she already knew. "I found out who you are," he said. She nodded, slowly, like he'd confirmed something she'd already decided. "There it is," she said. "I know how that sounds. It sounds like what it is." She leaned forward on the counter, both forearms resting on the wood, and looked at him with those dark eyes that were perfectly steady. "You humiliated me in front of 400 people because you thought I was nobody. You're here now because you know I'm not. That's not an apology. That's damage control." She paused. "I've grown up surrounded by men who apologize when they calculate it's necessary. You're doing the same thing. The only difference is you're doing it personally, which I suppose I should credit." Ronan was quiet. "You should know," she said, "that it's already out of my hands. Your grandfather. He arrived in Chicago this morning." She straightened. "He was planning to come anyway. He comes twice a year. This just changed the agenda." The cold that moved through Ronan's chest at those words was not a metaphor. It was physical. It started at the sternum and moved outward. "He knows," he said. He knew by midnight. Her voice was even. "His men called it in. He watched the footage by 2 a.m. When I spoke to him this morning, his first question was whether I wanted blood or whether I wanted to be left alone. I told him I wanted to be left alone." She paused. "He asked the same question again, which means he'd already started making other plans." Ronan said nothing. "You should go," she said. "Serafina, go." She held his gaze without blinking. "Whatever is happening between you and my grandfather is going to happen. I can't stop it, and I'm not trying to. I told him what I told him. What he does now is his choice." She picked up her pen. "But you being here doesn't change anything. You didn't come here for me. You came here for your business." He stood at her counter and understood, with a clarity that was almost physical, that she was right. He had come here for his business. The woman standing across from him had grown up in one of the most powerful criminal dynasties in America. She had walked away from it and built something small and genuine and her own. She had stood in a ballroom and faced his contempt and left with her composure intact. She had called her grandfather this morning and asked him not to act. She had done that knowing it might not work, and had done it anyway. And she was telling him to leave. He left. On the sidewalk, the November air hit him like a wall. He walked to the Escalade and stood with his hand on the door and did not get in immediately. "Back to the office?" Decker said. Ronan didn't answer for a moment. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. "Marcus." 2 words. "He's there." Ronan looked up at the street, at the ordinary neighborhood around him, at the bookstore with its hand-painted sign and its small window display. He typed back, "Where?" Marcus's response came in 4 seconds. "Your office. He's been there for 20 minutes. He came alone." Ronan Vale stood on a sidewalk in Lincoln Square and understood that Vittorio Moretti, 81 years old, the architect of an empire that had survived 4 decades and 6 federal investigations, had walked into his headquarters and waited for him. He got in the car. "Office," he said. "Now." They made it back in 31 minutes. Ronan went up in the private elevator alone and stood in the steel box as it rose and thought about what waited for him and whether there was any version of this in which he walked out of the next hour with everything still intact. He couldn't find one. The elevator opened onto the executive floor. His assistant looked up and said nothing, which meant she'd been told to say nothing. The door to his office was closed. Decker reached for it. "Wait outside," Ronan said. He opened the door himself and stepped through. Vittorio Moretti was sitting in the chair across from his desk. The guest chair, not his chair, which was a deliberate choice that communicated more than a speech could. He was a small man, shorter than Ronan had imagined, though everything about the way he inhabited space made him seem larger. 81 and still arrow-straight, silver-haired, wearing a dark coat that was expensive without advertising it. His hands rested on his knees. He was not holding anything. He did not need to. His eyes were Serafina's eyes. dark brown, perfectly still. "Mr. Vale," he said. His voice was quiet and precise and entirely without warmth. Ronan closed the door behind him. He crossed to his desk and stood behind it, not to claim authority over the space, because that was already gone, but because he needed something to do with his hands, and standing still in a doorway was not it. He looked at the old man across the desk and said the only thing available to him. "Don Moretti." "Sit down," Vittorio said. Ronan sat. The old man looked at him for a very long time, long enough that any other man would have started talking to fill the silence. Ronan understood that silence was the test, and he held it, and the effort cost him something he couldn't quantify. "I have been in this business for longer than you have been alive," Vittorio said finally. "In that time I have seen many men make many mistakes. The nature of the mistake is rarely the most important thing. What matters is the nature of the man who makes it." He paused. "You know what I saw in that footage?" "Yes," Ronan said. "Tell me." "You saw who I am when I believe I have power over someone?" Vittorio looked at him. Something in his expression shifted imperceptibly. "That is the correct answer," he said. "It is also the most dangerous answer because it means you already understand the problem and have simply chosen not to address it." He set his hands flat on his knees. "You did not hurt her because you did not know her name. You hurt her because you could. That is not ignorance. That is character." Ronan said nothing. "I have been in business with men like you before," Vittorio continued. "They are useful, in the way that certain tools are useful, until the moment they demonstrate that they have not grown beyond what they were at 25. He looked at Ronan steadily. "My granddaughter asked me to spare you." The words landed. "She called me this morning," Vittorio said. "She told me that a war would not serve her, that it would not serve this city, that you were, her word, capable of understanding your mistakes, which is more than she would grant most men." He tilted his head slightly. "She is more merciful than I am. She has always been more merciful than I am. It is the thing about her that frightens me most." He stood. Ronan stood. "I will not execute you," Vittorio said. "This time, because she asked me not to, and because her judgment, in my experience, is better than mine where character is concerned." He buttoned his coat. "But you will understand that her mercy is not free. There is a cost, and the cost is not negotiable." Ronan waited. "You will restore her dignity publicly," Vittorio said. "Before this city, before every person who witnessed your performance last night. You will make it clear, not through a statement, not through a spokesperson, not through a donation to a charity, personally, visibly, without ambiguity, that what you did was wrong, and that she is owed every measure of respect you withheld." He paused. "You have 24 hours. He moved toward the door. "If you do not," he said, "I will not come to Chicago again. I will simply send men who are less interested in conversation." He opened the door and walked out. Ronan stood alone in his office for a long moment. The city spread out below him, 30 stories of glass and altitude between him and everything he'd spent his life building. He looked at it and understood, with a precision that felt almost like clarity, that the man who had walked into this building 8 hours ago was not the same man who was going to walk out of it. He picked up his phone and called Marcus. "The mayor's Platinum Gala," he said. "Tomorrow night. Get me in." Marcus was quiet for 2 seconds. "That's an invitation-only event. Get me in." "And what are we doing when we're in?" Ronan looked at the skyline, at the lake beyond it, at the city that believed it knew who he was. "Something I've never done before," he said. He had 24 hours. He had a plan that required him to walk into the most watched room in Chicago and do the one thing a man like Ronan Vale was not built to do. But what he didn't know, what Marcus was about to tell him, his voice gone flat in a way that meant the news was very bad, was that 24 hours was no longer the timeline, because Vittorio Moretti had not in fact come to Chicago alone, and the men he had brought with him had already begun to move. Marcus Hale did not raise his voice. In 6 years of working for Ronan Vale, through 3 federal investigations, 2 rival hits, and 1 very bad night in Detroit that none of them discussed anymore, Marcus had never raised his voice. The flatness of his tone, when it drained of all color, was the closest thing he had to an alarm. "They're already inside," Marcus said. Marcus. Ronan still had his phone to his ear. He had not moved from the window. Below him, 30 stories down, a black sedan was pulling away from the curb. Vittorio Moretti, being driven somewhere Ronan could not follow. Inside what? Ronan said. The operation. All of it. Marcus's breath was audible. The Halstead warehouse. Security team stopped checking in 40 minutes ago. I've got nothing from the dock supervisors at Port Terminal 7. The servers that run the secondary ledger went offline 11 minutes ago, and they did not go offline because of a hardware failure. Ronan turned from the window. How many locations? That I've confirmed? 4. That I suspect? 8. Our people, not dead, displaced. There's a difference and it's intentional. Nobody's been hurt. They've just been moved. Neutralized without violence, which is worse, because it means whoever did this wanted us to understand they had the option of violence and chose not to use it. That's a message. Ronan understood the message. We could have killed them. We didn't. That's how little your empire means to us. He crossed to his desk and sat down and looked at the surface of it. The clean lines, the ordered files, the architecture of a life built to project absolute control, and understood that sometime in the last 45 minutes, while he had been sitting across from an old man and surviving the conversation, his empire had been quietly folded up like a piece of paper. Get everyone in, he said. Everyone who's still reachable. Conference room, 1 hour. Ronan, 1 hour, Marcus. He hung up and sat in the silence of his office and breathed. The next 55 minutes were the most controlled exercise in compartmentalization Ronan Vale had ever performed. He made 8 calls. He spoke to lawyers, to 3 of his operations managers, to a city councilman who owed him 3 different kinds of favors. He did not tell any of them what had happened. He asked specific questions and absorbed the answers and built a picture from the fragments that was worse than he'd expected. The Moretti Reach in Chicago was not theoretical. It was structural. It had been there for decades, woven into the city's logistics infrastructure in ways that his 7 years of empire building had been laid on top of without him understanding what was underneath. The Terminal 7 dock supervisors answered to a harbor authority subcontractor that had been a Moretti front company since 1987. 3 of the warehouses he used for secondary operations were leased through a real estate holding entity with Moretti fingerprints buried 4 layers down in the corporate structure. He had been operating inside their architecture the whole time and had mistaken their patience for absence. He had not taken territory. He had been permitted. That understanding arrived in his chest like something physical, like the drop of an elevator when the cable goes. The conference room held 9 people when he walked in. Marcus at the near end, Decker and Cole bracketing the door. 5 of his senior operations people, Harlan, Vega, the 2 Kowalski brothers who ran the port logistics, and a woman named Diane Chen who managed the financial architecture with a precision that had kept him out of federal crosshairs for 4 years. And one person who should not have been there. Jimmy Park sat third from the left with his hands flat on the table and his face doing the very specific thing it did when Jimmy had already made a decision he hadn't told anyone about yet. Jimmy Park was 38 and had been with Ronan since the beginning. Since the first year, when Ronan's operation was 3 warehouses and 24 men, and a reputation built on the credible promise of violence. Jimmy had been the one to make that promise credible more than once. He ran the enforcement side of the Vale organization with a quietness that was more frightening than volume, and he was Ronan's oldest functional relationship in this business. And the way he was sitting right now put every nerve Ronan had on full alert. Ronan sat at the head of the table. "You all know something has happened," he said. "I'm going to tell you exactly what. And then we're going to figure out what comes next." He laid it out in 8 minutes. No euphemism, no softening. The gala, the woman, the Moretti name, the old man in his office, the 4 confirmed neutralized locations. The message embedded in the restraint with which it had been done. When he finished, the room was very quiet. Harlan, who ran the Midwest Transit Network and had the particular weathered composure of someone who had survived a decade in this business through the consistent application of strategic cowardice, said, "What's our exposure?" "Total," Ronan said. "Define total." "I just did." Harlan looked at the table. Diane Chen said, "The secondary ledger going offline. How long until that becomes a recovery problem versus a loss problem?" Marcus. Marcus said, 72 hours before the automated reconciliation cycle flags the gap. After that, we have a paper trail problem that becomes a federal problem within a week. So we have 72 hours to restore access, Diane said. We don't restore access, Ronan said. That's not how this works. The Moretti family has the servers. They're not a criminal outfit we can send people to retrieve from. We negotiate or we burn the exposure and rebuild. Rebuilding the secondary ledger from scratch takes, Diane started. I know how long it takes. The room went quiet again. At the far end, Jimmy Park had still not said anything. He was looking at the table. His hands were still flat on its surface, and he was breathing through his nose in the slow, deliberate way of a man managing something. Ronan looked at him. Jimmy? Jimmy looked up. Say what you came in here to say. The room shifted. People who had been looking at Ronan now looked at Jimmy. People who had been looking at Jimmy looked at the table. I've been talking to Caruso, Jimmy said. The name landed like a stone in still water. Aldo Caruso was the Chicago outfit's nominal head, a 50-year-old man with inherited power, and the particular resentment of someone who had been waiting for an opportunity that kept not arriving. He and Ronan had a long and carefully managed hostility that had never tipped into open conflict, because open conflict required certainty about the outcome, and neither of them had been certain enough. When did you start talking to Caruso? Ronan said. 3 weeks ago. Jimmy's voice was even. Before any of this. He reached out, said there were opportunities being left on the table because of, his words, the management philosophy. The management philosophy. He meant you. The room's silence had a different quality now, harder, more airless. 3 weeks, Ronan said. You've been in communication with Caruso for 3 weeks, and you're telling me now. I'm telling you now because now it's relevant. It was relevant 3 weeks ago. Maybe. Jimmy's jaw shifted. Maybe I wanted to see how things developed. Ronan looked at him across the length of the table. The look did not carry anger. It carried the specific weight of a man recalibrating a relationship in real time, reassigning every interaction of the past 3 weeks to a new context, and finding that the new context explained things he hadn't understood at the time. What does Caruso want? Ronan said. He wants the port contracts, the Halstead storage network. He's willing to let everything else stay as is. He wants the backbone of the operation. He wants a partnership. He wants the backbone, Ronan said again. And he sent you to ask for it while the Moretti family has my servers, and 4 of my locations are dark, and I'm sitting here with exactly no leverage. He paused. That's not a partnership. That's an autopsy. Jimmy said nothing. Are you with him, or are you with me? Ronan said. The question sat in the air between them. Everyone in the room understood that the answer to this question would determine several things, some of which would not be comfortable for several people currently in this room. Jimmy Park looked at Ronan Vale for a long moment. I'm here, Jimmy said. I came here instead of going to him. That should tell you something. It tells me you haven't decided yet. Maybe I need to know if there's something left to decide for. The honesty of it was extraordinary in its bluntness. Ronan felt something shift in the room's atmosphere. Not approval exactly, but recognition. Jimmy was not defecting. Jimmy was being precisely what he had always been, transactional, direct, and dangerously pragmatic. There's a path, Ronan said. It's narrow, and it requires something I haven't done before. But it's there. The Moretti woman, Jimmy said. Yes. You're going to... What? Apologize publicly at some event? Tomorrow night. Mayor's Platinum Gala. Jimmy stared at him. You're going to walk into a black tie event and apologize to a woman in front of the city's entire power structure because an 81-year-old man told you to. Because it's the right move, Ronan said, and because it's the only move. It'll make you look weak, or it'll make me look like a man who understands when he's wrong. He held Jimmy's gaze. Those two things look the same to people who've never had to tell the difference. The people in that room tomorrow night will know the difference. Jimmy was quiet for a moment. Then he leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling and breathed out through his teeth. Caruso is going to hear about this, Jimmy said, within the hour. The Moretti old man walking into your building. That kind of thing travels. I know. He's going to move tonight. I know that too. And your plan is still the gala. My plan, Ronan said, is to give Vittorio Moretti what he asked for, because that's the only thing that makes everything else negotiable. Caruso can wait 24 hours. Caruso doesn't wait. He will if he thinks I'm still standing. Jimmy looked at him for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Not loyalty exactly, or not loyalty as its cleanest form. Something more complicated. The specific reluctant respect of a man who has worked with someone long enough to believe that if anyone could hold a bad hand and make it work, it was this particular person. All right, Jimmy said. What do you need? The meeting lasted another 30 minutes. Ronan assigned everyone a specific task with a specific deadline. He spoke with the directness of a man who had decided not to waste time on anything that was not immediately actionable, and he watched his people respond to that directness the way they always did, with the forward lean of purpose, with the particular energy that comes from being given a problem specific enough to actually solve. When the room cleared, Marcus stayed. He waited until they were alone. Jimmy's right that Caruso will move tonight, Marcus said. I know. You could preempt it. I could. Are you going to? Ronan stood at the window again. It was afternoon now, the light changing over the lake, the city going about its business 30 stories below with no idea what had been decided in this room. If I preempt Caruso tonight, I'm at war on two fronts by morning, Ronan said. Moretti and Caruso simultaneously, while 4 of my locations are dark and the secondary ledger is in someone else's hands. That's not a war. That's a conclusion. So we absorb whatever he does tonight. We document whatever he does tonight. There's a difference. I want to know exactly what he takes and from whom and how he does it. I want a complete picture by 6 a.m. And then we go to the gala. Marcus was quiet for a moment. The woman, he said. Serafina, the bookstore this morning. How did it go? Ronan didn't answer immediately. She told me to leave, he said. But? She asked her grandfather not to act. She did that before she knew I was coming, before she had any reason to believe I was going to do anything other than try to manage the situation from a distance. He paused. She did it because she thought a war would cost too many people something they shouldn't have to pay. That's a particular kind of character, Marcus said carefully. It is. And you still went there to do damage control. Ronan turned from the window and looked at him. Yes, he said. I did. Marcus held the look. He had the specific social intelligence of a man who understood the difference between what people said and what they meant, and who had the discipline to not always point out the gap. He pointed it out now. There's something you haven't said yet, Marcus said. She was right, Ronan said. In the bookstore. About why I was there. He paused. She was right about all of it. I went because I knew her name. That's the whole reason. Everything I said, the apology, the contrition, all of it was real in the sense that I meant the words, but the reason I was standing in her bookstore instead of sending a lawyer's letter was her last name. And now? Ronan considered the question. The afternoon light moved across the city below. Somewhere in Lincoln Square, in a narrow building with a hand-painted sign, a woman who had been offered the ability to start a war and had declined. It was shelving books or making notes on order forms or doing whatever it was that people did when they had decided that the life they chose mattered more than the life they were born into. Now I go to the gala, he said, and I do what I said I'd do, and after that, we see. That's not an answer to my question. No, Ronan said. It's not. Marcus picked up his files and moved toward the door. One more thing, he said. He paused with his hand on the door. The Moretti protection detail, the 4 men who were at the gala, they've been pulling back from their positions around the city this afternoon. Ronan went still. All of them? All 4, simultaneously, within the last 2 hours. That's not a withdrawal, Ronan said. No. Marcus's voice was entirely level. It's a consolidation. They're moving to a single location. Which location? We tracked them to a hotel on Michigan Avenue, the Harmon. Vittorio has the top 2 floors. Ronan stared at him. If they're all at the hotel, he said slowly, then nobody is. Nobody is watching the bookstore, Marcus said. Correct. The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds. Get someone to Clarion Books, Ronan said. Right now. Decker, his phone rang. Unknown number, Chicago area code. He answered. The voice on the other end was not one he recognized. Male, calm, with the particular professional flatness of someone performing a function rather than having a conversation. Mr. Vale, you're going to want to come to the corner of Linden and Western. There's something here that belongs in your care. The line went dead. Ronan looked at Marcus. Linden and Western, he said. That's 2 blocks from Clarion Books, Marcus said. Ronan was already moving toward the door when his phone buzzed again. A photograph. Taken from street level, slightly blurred with speed, timestamp 11 minutes ago. Serafina, on the sidewalk outside her store, her arm held by a man in a dark coat who was not looking at the camera. Ronan Vale stood in the doorway of his own office and felt something happen in his chest that he could not immediately name. Not fear exactly, because fear was a thing he had trained out of himself over a decade of choices that required its absence, but something adjacent to it, something with the same heat and the same velocity, something that moved through him like the split second before a collision. When you understand that impact is no longer avoidable, and the only question is how much it costs you on the other side. Ronan moved, not the controlled movement of a man executing a plan, the raw, immediate movement of a man responding to something that had bypassed strategy entirely and hit somewhere older and more animal. He was through the office door before Marcus finished the sentence, and he was in the elevator before Decker had registered that the situation had changed, and he was in the lobby in 40 seconds and on the sidewalk in 45, and the November air hit him like a wall, and he was already on the phone. Linden and Western, he said to Cole. Now. The Escalade was there in 90 seconds. Ronan was in the back and moving before the door fully closed. Marcus called twice. He let it ring. He was looking at the photograph on his phone. Serafina on the sidewalk, the man's hand on her arm, the blur of motion that suggested the photographer had been moving fast or had been trying not to be seen. And he was doing the thing he did when emotion threatened to compromise function. He cataloged. He made a list. He looked at the photograph with the specific discipline of a man who had trained himself to see information rather than feeling. The man's coat, dark wool, expensive, no visible logos. His posture, upright, not aggressive. The body language of someone guiding rather than forcing. Serafina's face was turned slightly away from the camera. She was not struggling. That mattered. That was the piece of the photograph that kept the temperature of the thing in his chest below a threshold he could not afford to cross right now. She was not struggling. Cole pulled to the corner of Linden and Western in 4 minutes. The street was ordinary, residential, tree-lined, the kind of block that existed in the in-between zones of the city where neighborhoods hadn't decided yet what they were becoming. There was a diner on the near corner with steamed windows, a laundromat, a small parking structure. Standing on the sidewalk outside the diner, alone, in a coat that was not warm enough for the temperature, was Serafina Moretti. She was standing very straight, both hands in her pockets, looking at the corner like she had been told to stand there and had decided that if she was going to stand there, she was going to do it on her own terms. There was a cut on her lower lip, very small, already darkening at the edge. Her hair had come loose on one side. Ronan was out of the car before it stopped moving. She turned when she heard the door. She looked at him and said nothing, which he understood immediately as its own communication. Not relief, not accusation, something more complicated and more tired than either. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No." "Your lip." "I'm not hurt." Voice was level and very controlled, and he could hear the effort underneath it. The specific strain of keeping your voice level when the rest of you wants to do something else. Someone grabbed my arm on the sidewalk outside the store. I pulled away. He let go. That was it. Who was it? I don't know. Moretti's men pulled back from their positions this afternoon, the same window when... I know. Her jaw tightened. I know. My grandfather's security pulled back and someone else moved in. I'm aware of what that means. She looked at him steadily. The question is why you got a phone call telling you where I was. Ronan had been asking himself the same question for the last 4 minutes. He looked at her on the sidewalk, in the cold, with her coat pulled across her chest and the small dark cut on her lip, and he understood that someone had arranged this. Not the grab itself maybe, but the aftermath. Someone had wanted him to come here and find her here, and for that sequence of events to mean something or to be observed or to create a specific picture that was useful to someone. Get in the car, he said. I don't think that's Serafina. He said her name and then stopped, because the next thing he was going to say was something about her being in the open and exposed, and the fact that whoever had sent that photograph had done it because they wanted him moving and reactive and off script, which meant standing on this sidewalk was exactly what they wanted. He stopped himself from saying all of that in the clinical operational language that was his first reflex, and said instead, more quietly, "Please." She looked at him for a moment. Something moved in her face, not softening exactly, more like reassessment. Then she walked to the Escalade and got in. He got in after her. Cole was already pulling away from the curb. Marcus called again. This time Ronan answered. "Tell me," he said. "The phone call you got? We traced the number. Prepaid, disposable, purchased in cash 6 days ago from a convenience store in Bridgeport." Bridgeport. "Caruso's neighborhood," Marcus said. "And there's more. The man in the photograph. We got a better look. Cross-referenced the code against our surveillance feeds from the past 3 weeks. He's been in our footage twice before. Once outside Harlan's office building, once near the port terminal. He's Caruso's. He's Caruso's, which means Caruso knew about Serafina before today. Before the gala, even. He's been building a picture of your pressure points for at least 3 weeks, which matches when he first reached out to Jimmy." Ronan looked at the window. The city moved past. He was very still. "Jimmy knew about her," Ronan said. It was not a question. The silence from Marcus lasted exactly 1 second too long. "Marcus? I don't know what Jimmy knew. But he was the one who told Caruso's people which events you'd be attending this month. We have that. Phone record, 3 weeks old, Jimmy's personal cell to a number that traces back to Caruso's organization. He was passing your schedule." The temperature of the thing in Ronan's chest dropped about 15 degrees. He sat in the back of a moving car next to the woman he had destroyed in public 36 hours ago and understood, with the particular cold clarity of a man who has just watched a map reoriented, that the last 3 weeks had been a construction. Not entirely. Jimmy's ambivalence was real. His calculation was genuine. But the architecture of the pressure that had built around Ronan since the gala had not been spontaneous. The timing of Caruso's approach, the selection of the gala as an event where something could go wrong, the photograph taken 11 minutes before the phone call. He could not prove that Caruso had engineered the champagne moment. He could not prove the drunken socialite who'd shoved Serafina had been placed there. He could not prove it. But he understood it the way you understand a structure when you look at it from the right angle, not by proving each beam, but by seeing that the whole thing stands in one direction. "Where's Jimmy now?" he said. "Office. He hasn't left. Keep him there. Don't tell him we've talked." He hung up. Serafina was looking at him. She had been watching him through the entire call with the particular attention of someone who was very good at reading half a conversation. "Caruso," she said. "You know him. I know the name. My grandfather has mentioned him as a secondary problem in this city. Someone waiting for the right moment." She paused. Was the gala the right moment? I think someone helped it be. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the city resolved into familiar patterns. They were moving south and west, toward Ronan's secondary operations building, a converted warehouse in Pilsen that was not on any public record connected to Vale Meridian. "The man who grabbed me," she said, "he didn't hurt me. He held my arm for about 4 seconds and said..." She stopped. She was looking at her own hands. He said, "Tell Vale that Caruso sends his regards and that the clock started this morning." He was establishing that Caruso could reach you. I gathered that, yes. And establishing that I'd come for you. He said it flatly, not as an observation about himself, but as a tactical notation. Then he heard how it sounded and looked at her. "Which I would have regardless, not because of..." "I understand what it was," she said. "You don't have to explain the logic to me. I grew up in a family where people demonstrate capability and create obligation. I know what that move looks like." She looked at him steadily. "The question is what you're going to do about it. The gala is still happening. Tonight. Tomorrow. I have until tomorrow night." He looked at his watch. 19 hours. "And Caruso. Caruso is a problem I handle after. She looked at him the way she'd looked at him across the bookstore counter, with that particular dark-eyed steadiness that had the quality of someone reading a document and deciding how much of it they believe. "After," she said. "After." "What if he doesn't give you after?" Ronan didn't answer, because the Escalade was pulling to the warehouse entrance, and the door was opening, and what waited inside was going to require his complete attention, and he knew it. What waited inside was Jimmy Park. Jimmy was sitting on a folding chair in the center of the warehouse floor, with Cole and two other men standing at various distances that communicated clearly that sitting was not optional. He had his elbows on his knees and his hands loose between them, and he looked up when Ronan walked in without the expression of a man who had been caught. He looked up with the expression of a man who had already decided where he stood and was waiting to have the conversation. Serafina stayed near the door. One of the men moved to stand near her without being asked. Ronan walked to the center of the floor and stood 6 feet from Jimmy and looked at him. "Tell me about Caruso," he said. I already told you about Caruso. Tell me about the schedule." Jimmy's jaw shifted, the first flicker of something. Not guilt, not exactly, but the recognition that a specific thing had been found. He looked at the floor for a moment, then back up. "He asked where you'd be," Jimmy said. "I told him. That's all it was." "You told him I'd be at the Harbor Legacy Gala." "Yeah." "And you told him 3 weeks ago." "Yeah." "Before you told me he'd reached out. I wasn't sure yet which way I was going." "Jimmy," Ronan's voice was very quiet. "The woman who got shoved into me at the gala, the one who spilled the champagne, was she Caruso's?" The silence that followed lasted long enough to be its own answer. Jimmy looked at the concrete floor between his feet. He breathed out through his nose. "I didn't know who she was," Jimmy said. "Neither did Caruso. The play was just create a situation, something that would destabilize the East Coast alliances enough that you'd need Caruso's relationships to stabilize them. Nobody knew she was Moretti. Nobody knew what the fallout would be. But she got shoved into me intentionally. The situation was created intentionally. What happened was, it went further than the plan. Because she was Moretti's granddaughter. Nobody knew that. But you created the situation." Jimmy was quiet. "Look at me," Ronan said. Jimmy looked up. "You created the situation that put everything at risk. The East Coast alliances, the port contracts, the server access. All of it, the entire sequence of the last 36 hours, started with a woman being shoved at a party because you were helping Caruso build pressure." "I was protecting the operation," Jimmy said. "Caruso was coming regardless. He's been building for 2 years. I made a calculation that a controlled negotiation was better than a war we weren't ready for. You made that calculation without telling me. You wouldn't have listened. That's not the point. That is the point." Jimmy stood up. The men around him shifted, but he didn't look at them. He looked at Ronan with the particular exhausted ferocity of a man who has been holding something for a long time and has reached the limit of how long he can hold it. "You don't listen, Ronan. Not to me, not to Marcus, not to anybody who tells you something you don't want to hear. You built this whole machine around yourself and you made yourself the only person who gets to decide anything. And I watched you do it. And I told you twice in 3 years that it was a structural problem, and you told me to handle my side and let you handle yours." He breathed. "So I handled my side." The warehouse was completely silent. Ronan stood in the center of the concrete floor and felt the words hit him the way specific truths hit. Not as argument, but as recognition, the awful, specific recognition of something you have known and refused to look at directly. He was quiet for a long time. "Is that what you needed to say?" he said. "Yeah," Jimmy said. That's what I needed to say." "Okay." Ronan looked at him. "Okay, you're not wrong about any of it." He paused. "You're also in business with the man who had a woman grabbed on a public sidewalk this afternoon to send me a message." Jimmy's face changed. "He did what?" "Serafina, 2 blocks from her store. His man held her arm for 4 seconds and told her to relay a message." Ronan watched Jimmy's expression cycle through surprise and then something harder. "You didn't know?" "No." Jimmy's voice had changed entirely. "No, that was not part of anything I agreed to." "I know." Ronan studied him. That's why you're still standing. Jimmy sat back down. He put his face in his hands for a moment. Not crying, the gesture of someone under enormous pressure finding 6 seconds to feel it fully before putting it back down. And then he straightened. What do you need? Jimmy said. Everything you have on Caruso's current positions. Locations, personnel, whatever you've got from the last 3 weeks. I have a lot. I know you do. Marcus is going to take everything from you and build a picture. After the gala. After the gala, Jimmy repeated. 19 hours. Jimmy looked at him. You're still doing the gala? Yes. After all of this? Especially after all of this. From near the door, Serafina spoke for the first time since they'd entered the warehouse. She spoke quietly, but the warehouse was quiet enough that it carried. Mr. Park, she said. Jimmy looked at her. You said nobody knew who I was when it was arranged. That's true. I believe you. Her voice was even and without accusation. But Caruso knew afterward, and he used me this afternoon anyway, as a pressure point. That's the man you were negotiating with. Jimmy said nothing. I'm not asking you to choose, she said. I'm just making sure you have accurate information. She looked at Ronan. Can we go? He nodded. He looked at Jimmy once more. Stay here tonight. Marcus will come to you in an hour. He walked to the door. Serafina fell into step beside him without being asked. They walked out into the cold together, and the Escalade was waiting, and somewhere in the city, Aldo Caruso was making calculations about how much time he had before Ronan Vale stopped absorbing pressure and started generating it. They were in the car for 2 minutes before she said anything. Your friend. Jimmy's not... Ronan stopped. He's not wrong about the structural problem. No, she said. He's not. You were listening. I was standing 8 feet away in a concrete room. He looked at her. The city was moving past the darkened windows again. Her profile against the glass was very still. Why did you ask your grandfather not to act? He said. The real reason. Not the war cost. She was quiet for a moment. Because I've watched men destroy each other my entire life, she said. And I've watched the wreckage land on people who had nothing to do with the original argument. The dock workers, the drivers, the people whose livelihoods are threaded through these operations without knowing it. She paused. My grandfather's version of resolution involves a lot of that wreckage. And mine doesn't? Not so far. Tonight, at least. She looked at him. But the night's not over. The Escalade slowed. They were stopped at a light on Michigan Avenue, and through the windshield, Ronan could see the top floors of the Harmon Hotel, where Vittorio Moretti had the top 2 floors and had pulled his protection detail back from his granddaughter an hour before someone grabbed her arm on a public sidewalk. He looked at the hotel. He looked at it for 3 seconds longer than he should have. Marcus, he said. Marcus answered on the first ring. The detail pulling back, Ronan said. Vittorio pulled his men back this afternoon. His granddaughter was grabbed 40 minutes later. Is that... He stopped. He was thinking through it, the architecture of it, the specific sequence. Is that possible that he knew it would happen? The silence from Marcus was 4 seconds long. I've been sitting with the same question, Marcus said, for the last 20 minutes. Conclusion. I don't have one yet, but the timing is... Marcus paused. The timing is precise in a way that's very hard to attribute to coincidence. Ronan stared at the hotel's upper floors. He pulled the protection back, Ronan said slowly, to create a window. Someone used the window. She was grabbed. I was called. I came for her. He worked it through. Every step of that chain puts me in a specific position relative to her. It creates an obligation, a visible, demonstrable obligation that anyone watching would... He stopped. He looked at Serafina. She was already looking at him. Her expression told him she had been running the same calculation, that she had been running it since before he started speaking, that she had arrived at the same place he was arriving now, and had been sitting with it in silence, waiting to see if he would get there himself. Your grandfather, he said. Her face was very still. He didn't just come to Chicago to manage a grievance, Ronan said. He came to Chicago because he had already decided what he wanted, and he needed a specific sequence of events to build the conditions for it. He paused. The gala was the starting point, but the ending point, the ending he's working toward, isn't just my public apology. Serafina said nothing. He wants an alliance, Ronan said. Not a punitive settlement. An alliance. And he needed me to come for you. To demonstrate, in front of his own men and anyone watching, that I would move for you without being ordered to, before he'd consider me worth. Before he'd consider me worth the investment. The word hung in the car's sealed air. Serafina turned her face toward the window. Outside, the Harmon Hotel's upper floors were lit against the early dark, and Ronan watched her reflection in the glass. The particular set of her jaw, the way she breathed once, slowly, through her nose, the way her hands stayed perfectly still in her lap. He didn't tell you, Ronan said. He doesn't tell me things, she said. He arranges them. You knew something was off. I knew the timing was wrong when the detail pulled back. She paused. I didn't know what he was building. I don't always know what he's building until I'm already inside it. Something moved in her voice. Not bitterness exactly, but the specific exhaustion of someone who has spent years navigating a powerful person's architecture and has made an uneasy peace with the fact that they will never fully see the blueprint. He loves me. That's real. Everything else he does. He does because he has a 70-year perspective on how power works, and he believes he's helping. He pulled your protection to put you in danger. He pulled my protection because he knew Caruso's man wouldn't hurt me. He knew exactly how far it would go. He calculated the whole thing to the centimeter. She looked back from the window. That's what makes him terrifying. Not the violence, the precision. Ronan sat with that for a moment. Are you angry? He said. She considered the question with a seriousness that told him she was not going to give him a reflexive answer. Yes, she said. I am. It doesn't change anything, but yes. He nodded. He looked at the hotel one more time as the light changed and the Escalade moved through the intersection and the building disappeared behind them. I'm still going to the gala, he said. I know. And I need you there. She looked at him. Not because of your grandfather, he said. Or not only. What I do tomorrow night, it needs to be real. The apology. And it can't be real if you're not in the room. He held her gaze. I know I don't have the right to ask you. She was quiet for a long time, long enough that he didn't try to fill it. Pick me up at 8, she said. He slept 3 hours. He was back at the operations building by 5 a.m., and Marcus was already there, which meant Marcus had not slept at all, which was a thing Marcus did during critical windows and never complained about, and Ronan had long since stopped commenting on. The picture Marcus had built from Jimmy's intelligence on Caruso was comprehensive and extremely bad. Caruso had not been waiting 2 years. He had been building for 4, using the cover of the legitimate business interests he'd inherited from his father, a waste management empire, 3 commercial laundries, a construction contracting firm, to establish relationships with the same East Coast families that formed the backbone of Ronan's alliances. He hadn't tried to displace those relationships. He'd positioned himself underneath them as a secondary option, a contingency, so that when the moment came to switch primary partnerships, the families would have somewhere already warm to move to. The moment he'd been waiting for was Ronan's first serious exposure. The gala had been that moment. He's meeting with 2 of the 3 East Coast families today, Marcus said. He had a legal pad in front of him covered in his small, precise handwriting. We confirmed it 20 minutes ago. Lunch? Separately, both in the city. He's moving fast because he knows your timeline. He knows about the Moretti ultimatum. He knows you have until tonight. He's trying to lock in at least one family commitment before you walk into that gala, so that even if the public apology works and Vittorio stands down, you still have a structural hole you can't fill. Ronan looked at the legal pad, at the names on it, at the architecture of something that had been built patiently over 4 years and aimed precisely at the moment he was currently standing in. What's his current location? Ronan said. His primary residence in Bridgeport. He hasn't left yet this morning. Marcus paused. Ronan. What? If you go to Caruso before the gala, you risk the whole thing. You're supposed to be walking into that room tonight as a man who chose accountability over retaliation. If you spend the hours before it dealing with Caruso through the kinds of methods Caruso responds to. I know. It changes what tonight means. I know, Marcus. I'm not sure you do. Because you have a look right now that I've seen twice before, And both times it preceded a decision that cost us something significant. Ronan looked at him. "What do you recommend?" he said. "Let Jimmy handle Caruso. Jimmy knows the territory, he has the relationships, and he has something to prove. Keep yourself clean for tonight. And if Jimmy's not enough, then you deal with Caruso after the gala from a position of restored alliance with the Moretti family, which makes you about 30% less vulnerable than you are right now." Ronan was quiet. He looked at the legal pad. He looked at the windows, which showed a gray Chicago morning, the lake flat and colorless under an overcast sky. He called Jimmy. Jimmy answered on the second ring. "Caruso's got meetings today," Ronan said. "East Coast families, you know which ones." "Ricci and Tanner," Jimmy said immediately. "Yeah, I know. Can you get to them before Caruso does?" "A beat. Ricci, maybe. Tanner's harder. He doesn't know me well enough." "What do you need?" "A show of good faith that means something. Something I can put on the table that tells them you're still operational despite what they're hearing." Ronan thought for 3 seconds. "The Halstead contracts. Tell them the storage network is available for their Chicago side operations at 15% below current rates, locked for 18 months. That's a significant concession. It's a tactical loss for a strategic position. Make the call." "And Caruso?" Ronan was quiet for a moment. "Tell him I want a meeting, tonight, after the gala. Tell him I'll come to him." The silence from Jimmy was brief, but weighted. "That's going to read as a concession, too." "Let it read that way." Ronan's voice was level. "Let him spend the day thinking he's already won." He hung up and looked at Marcus. "Now," he said, "walk me through tonight." The mayor's Platinum Gala occupied the Grand Hall of the Chicago Museum of Civic Arts, a room with 40-foot ceilings and marble floors and the accumulated weight of 100 years of the city's self-regard. It was larger and more formal than the Harbor Legacy event, and the guest list was the power list. Judges, federal officials, 3 members of Congress, the heads of every significant financial institution in the city. The people who, publicly, were the city. And underneath that public layer, threaded through it like rebar through concrete, the people who actually ran things. Both layers would be present tonight. Ronan understood, as he stood in front of the mirror in his apartment at 7:15, with a fresh suit and a face that showed the 2 days he'd had if you knew what to look for, that what he was about to do had no precedent in his professional life. Not the apology itself. He had apologized strategically before, had said the words that restored a relationship or closed a gap. But those had been calibrated, calculated, offered precisely because the math required them. Tonight was different. Tonight the apology was real and public and would be witnessed by people who would use it or misuse it or file it away as information. And he was going to do it anyway because the alternative was to be exactly the man he had been 2 nights ago. The man who had stood in that ballroom and taken a woman apart in public because the math said he could. He was done with that math. He was not entirely sure when he had decided this. He thought it might have been in the warehouse, listening to Jimmy say the things Jimmy had been holding for 3 years. Or in the car, listening to Serafina describe her grandfather's precision and call it terrifying. Or somewhere in the small hours of the morning, sitting at a desk with Chicago spread out below him, and no calculation in front of him, just the specific silence of a man sitting with what he actually was. He picked up his keys and left. He arrived at her address, the upper floor of a narrow building in Lincoln Square, 2 blocks from the bookstore, at 8 exactly. He was not a man who was late. She was at the door at 8:01, which told him she had been ready and had waited inside for 60 seconds rather than standing at the curb, which was a choice that communicated something. She wore a dark dress, long and simply cut, and her hair was up and she looked like what she was. Someone who had been born into a world of formal rooms and had learned to inhabit them without being consumed by them. The cut on her lip had faded to almost nothing. She looked at him when she stepped outside. "You slept," she said. 3 hours. "It shows." "I know." She looked at him for another moment with those dark eyes that were always reading something below the surface. "Are you ready for this?" she said. "No," he said. "Let's go." The museum's grand hall was already full when they arrived. Ronan had timed it deliberately. Not fashionably late, but late enough that the room was settled into its patterns. the clusters of conversation established so that the entrance would register without being theatrical. He wanted it noticed. He did not want it to look like he wanted it noticed. He felt the room change when they walked in. It was subtle, a slight shift in the ambient noise, a turning of heads that happened in a chain reaction, quiet and fast. He had walked into rooms for 15 years, and he knew exactly what it felt like when a room took notice of you. This was different. This was a room noticing two things at once and processing the combination and arriving at confusion. Ronan Vale, in public, with a woman who was not a business associate or a social ornament. Ronan Vale, who had publicly destroyed a woman 2 nights ago, walking into a room with that same woman on his arm and looking. This was the part that confused them, like he had been the one diminished by what had happened. He steered them to the center of the room, deliberately. No edges, no corners, no position that could be read as calculated retreat. The center, where the light was even and the sightlines were clear. He stopped. He said, clearly enough to be heard by the nearest 30 people without projecting, "Could I have everyone's attention for a moment?" The room did not go immediately silent. It went quiet in stages, the way a room does when something unexpected interrupts its momentum. First the people nearest, then rippling outward as those people stopped talking and turned, and the silence itself became the signal that something was happening. Within 40 seconds, the room was as quiet as 400 people in a marble hall can be. Ronan Vale stood in the center of it and did not adjust his posture or his expression or anything about himself to make the moment easier. He looked at the room, at the faces he knew, at the people who owed him things, and the people he owed things to, and the people who were simply watching because they were the kind of people who watched. And he spoke. 2 nights ago, at the Harbor Legacy Gala, I publicly humiliated a woman who had done nothing to deserve it. I judged her appearance and her background, and I did it in front of witnesses because I believed I could, because I thought the gap between my position and hers gave me the right to make her small. He paused. I was wrong. Not in the sense that I miscalculated, I was morally wrong. I was cruel to someone who deserved my respect, and I was cruel publicly. And the only appropriate response to a public wrong is a public acknowledgement. He turned slightly to include Serafina in the line of his address. Serafina, he said, what I said to you was inexcusable. What I demonstrated about my own character was inexcusable. You're owed an apology that is worth something. Not a legal settlement, not a private message, not a donation to a cause. This, he held her gaze, in front of the same city that watched me do it. I'm sorry. And then, because Vittorio had required it, but also because it was right, and because the two things could coexist, Ronan Vale lowered his head. A man who had not bowed his head before another human being in 15 years of building an empire on the premise that he never would. The room held its breath. Serafina looked at him. She looked at him for a long moment while the silence stretched, and 400 people waited, and the marble and the light and the 40-foot ceilings held everything in suspension. I accept, she said. The room exhaled. For approximately 90 seconds, the air in the hall had the particular quality of a collective recalibration. People deciding what they had just witnessed and what it meant and how to file it. Ronan straightened, and the ambient noise of the room reassembled itself around them, and he turned toward the bar because he needed somewhere to direct his movement, and the nearest glass of water was 10 feet away. He had taken 4 steps when the voice came from the right. Well, that was remarkable. Damian Cortez was 45, broad-shouldered, wearing a white dinner jacket that cost money but wore cheap, with a smile that had the specific quality of a man who believes he is the most intelligent person present. He operated out of the city's south side with interests that overlapped with 3 of Caruso's secondary operations, and that Ronan had been carefully managing the borders of for 2 years. He was not a significant threat. He was exactly the kind of man who became dangerous in the vacuum created by a significant threat, which was a different thing. He was also holding a glass of champagne and looking at Serafina with the particular expression of a man who has decided that a woman in a room is something to be commented on. The lady who tamed Chicago's king, Cortez said. I have to say, I didn't believe the story when I heard it, that Ronan Vale got brought to heel by a woman at a charity event. He sipped his champagne. But here you are, both of you. He looked at Serafina with an assessment that made the evaluation explicit. Congratulations, that's quite a trick. The word trick landed in the air. Ronan felt his hand tighten at his side. The specific physical preparation, the tightening of the tendons in his right hand, the shift of his weight to his rear foot, that preceded his most extreme responses. He had been managing that response for 2 days. He had just publicly demonstrated, in front of 400 witnesses, that he was a man capable of choosing something other than his worst instinct. He looked at Serafina. She was already looking at Cortez, and the expression on her face had changed, not to anger, not to the careful composure she'd maintained for 48 hours, to something else, something cooler and more deliberate, something that looked, Ronan thought, very much like the face of a woman who had decided to stop choosing restraint. "Mr. Cortez," she said. Her voice was perfectly even, conversational almost. "The waste disposal contracts you've been running through the city's South Side commercial district," she said. "The ones with the inflated cubic footage reporting that's been generating approximately $400,000 in phantom billing per quarter. The oversight committee chair who's been signing off? His name is Robert Aldis, and he's been signing off because you've been paying for his daughter's graduate school tuition through a shell entity in Delaware." She tilted her head slightly. "I have the account numbers, the transfer records, the emails, all of it." Cortez's smile was still there, technically. It had stopped reaching his eyes. "The contractor relationships," she continued conversationally, as though she were discussing the weather. "Specifically, the building materials supplier you've been using for the Lakeview development, the one that's been substituting below-spec concrete on load-bearing elements. The structural assessments that have been signed and filed and approved. I have copies of the originals alongside copies of what was actually built." She paused. "People live in those buildings, Mr. Cortez." The smile was gone. Around them, the nearest cluster of guests had gone very still. Word was moving through the room in the rapid, quiet way of a crowd that understands something significant is happening. Ronan stood beside her and did not say a word and did not move, and watched Damien Cortez's face cycle through the specific sequence of a man who has just understood that what he thought was a social encounter was, in fact, a dismantling. "Who are you?" Cortez said. His voice had changed entirely. "My name," she said, "is Serafina Moretti." From 3 different positions around the room, near the entrance, by the east wall, at the far end of the bar, 3 men in evening dress moved simultaneously. Not fast, not dramatically. They moved with the specific unhurried precision of people who have done this many times and know that speed is for amateurs. They converged on Damien Cortez from 3 angles. Cortez looked at them. He looked at Serafina. He looked at Ronan. "You want to take a walk, Mr. Cortez?" one of the men said. Not a question. Cortez put his champagne glass down on a passing tray with a steadiness that Ronan recognized as the last performance of a man trying to maintain the appearance of control in the absence of any. Then he walked. The 3 men flanked him toward a side exit, and the room watched it happen. And then the room turned back to its conversations, and the ambient noise reassembled itself with the practiced ease of a crowd that has decided, collectively, that discretion is the appropriate response. Ronan looked at her. She was watching the side exit. Her profile was perfectly still. Her breathing was even. "How long have you had that?" he said. "The Cortez file?" 8 months. She looked at him. "I keep files. It's a habit I inherited and couldn't shake even when I left." "You came here tonight with that ready." "I came here tonight thinking I might need it." She paused. "Or something like it." "You didn't need it. You could have let him talk." "No," she said. "I couldn't." Her voice was even, but something underneath it had an edge. "I spent 2 nights absorbing the consequences of one man's decision that I was small enough to treat carelessly. I'm not absorbing another one in the same week." The room around them was moving again, the normal current of an event reasserting itself, but differently now, with a new orientation, the way water flows differently after a channel has been redirected. People who had been looking at Ronan all evening were now looking at her. People who had been weighing the significance of his apology were now recalibrating to include what they had just witnessed. The room, Ronan understood, had changed its mind about who it was looking at. Then his phone vibrated in his breast pocket. He glanced at it. "Marcus. 1 line. Caruso moved early. Jimmy's down. Call me." He looked at the message for 2 seconds. His jaw tightened. He looked at Serafina. "I have to make a call," he said. "Go," she said. She was already scanning the room with those steady eyes. "I'm fine." He moved toward the side corridor and hit Marcus's number, and Marcus answered before the first ring completed. "How bad?" Ronan said. "Jimmy's in an ambulance," Marcus said. "He got to Ricci before Caruso did. The meeting went fine." On his way out, 2 of Caruso's men were waiting in the parking structure. Marcus's voice was controlled and absolutely flat. "He's alive. Broken ribs, laceration on his head. He's conscious. Caruso knew Jimmy was running my play. Someone told him, either someone in our conference room last night or someone in Ricci's office today." Ronan stood in the side corridor of the museum with the sound of 400 people behind a wall and the phone against his ear, and felt the temperature drop again in his chest. Lower this time, colder, past the threshold where the cold was just clarity, and into the territory where it became something with a harder edge. "The meeting tonight," he said. "Caruso is expecting me." "Yes. Change the location. Don't tell him until an hour before. Use a neutral site, the Alderman Club on Wabash, private room. Tell the manager it's a last-minute booking from Vale Meridian. He knows the account. And security? Ours and his, equal numbers, 5 each, weapons checked at the door." "He won't agree to the weapons condition." "He will," Ronan said, "because I'm going to tell him I'm coming alone except for the security, which means he gets 5 men in the room with me, and the only way he refuses that condition is if he's planning to kill me outright, which he's not, because killing me right now puts him in direct conflict with Vittorio Moretti, and he's not ready for that." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "And are you ready to walk into a room with Caruso tonight?" Ronan looked at the wall in front of him. Stone, smooth, expensive. He thought about Jimmy in an ambulance. He thought about Serafina on a sidewalk with a man's hand on her arm. He thought about 4 years of patient construction aimed directly at him and activated precisely when he was most exposed. "Yes," he said. He put the phone in his pocket and turned back toward the hall and walked through the door and stopped. The room had changed again. Not in the ambient social way of a crowd shifting its attention. In a specific directed way, the way a room changes when a significant person enters it. Vittorio Moretti stood near the entrance of the grand hall. He was not dressed for the event. Dark coat, same as this morning, the coat of a man who had not come to attend the gala, but to observe a specific thing that was happening at the gala. He stood very still just inside the entrance with 2 men Ronan didn't recognize flanking him at a distance, and he was looking across the room. Not at Ronan, at Serafina, and on his face, that precise, controlled, 81-year-old face that had shown Ronan nothing but perfect authority this morning, was an expression Ronan had not expected, not calculation, not satisfaction at a plan arriving at its intended conclusion, something much older and much simpler than either. Serafina saw him from across the room. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, wordless, across the entire length of the marble hall, that Ronan understood was not for him to interpret, and not his to know. Then Vittorio looked at Ronan, and his expression changed, became again what it had been this morning, evaluative, patient. The expression of a man watching a structure he has been building for longer than the other person in the room has been aware of it, checking the final load-bearing element of a structure he had always believed would hold. Ronan held Vittorio's gaze across the length of the marble hall and understood, in that specific moment, that the old man had come tonight not to oversee a transaction, but to witness something he had not been certain he would see. A man choosing correctly, not because he was ordered to, not because the math required it, because he had looked at who he was and decided, at some cost, to be something else. Vittorio gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Then he turned and walked back through the entrance and was gone. The 2 men who had flanked him dissolved into the crowd's periphery and then were not there, the way water is and then isn't, and the room continued around the space where the old man had stood as though he had never occupied it. Ronan stood for 3 seconds in the doorway of the side corridor and breathed. Then he straightened his jacket and walked back into the room. Serafina was where he'd left her, near the center of the hall, holding a glass of water she hadn't touched, and speaking quietly with a woman Ronan recognized as a federal circuit court judge. She finished the exchange as he approached, and the judge moved away, and Serafina turned to look at him with those dark eyes that read everything. "Your grandfather was here," he said. "I saw him. He came to check the work. He came to see if you did it," she said. "There's a difference." She looked at him steadily. "Did you see his face when you bowed your head?" "No, I was looking at you." She was quiet for a moment. "He looked surprised," she said, "which from him is extraordinary." She set the water glass on a passing tray. "He didn't think you would actually do it. He ordered me to do it." "He ordered you to. He didn't believe you would." She paused. "He's been ordering men to demonstrate character for 60 years. Most of them find a way around it that satisfies the letter of the requirement without the substance." She looked at him with an expression that was careful, and also, somewhere underneath the carefulness, something warmer than what she'd allowed before. "You didn't find a way around it." "I didn't want to," he said. She heard that. He watched her hear it. The slight shift in her breathing, the way her gaze held his a half-second longer than necessary before she looked across the room. "What's happened?" she said. "Your face changed when you came back from the corridor." "Jimmy's in an ambulance. Caruso moved early." Her jaw tightened. "How bad?" "Alive. Broken ribs." It was a message, not a conclusion. He paused. "I have a meeting with Caruso tonight. After this." She looked at him sharply. "Alone?" "5 security each. Neutral location." "That's not what I asked. I'll have Marcus and Decker." "Ronan." She said his name and stopped. He watched her decide something. He could see the decision being made, the precise moment of it, the way her expression settled into something resolved. "I'm coming." I'm not asking," she said. "Caruso put his hands on me today. Through a proxy, but still. If you walk into a room with him tonight without me present, he will read it as confirmation that I am a pressure point he can continue to use." She held his gaze. "I'm not a pressure point. He needs to understand that in person." Ronan looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. They left the gala at 10:40. The Escalade moved south through the city's nighttime geography, the lit corridors of downtown giving way to the darker, more honest streets of the South Side, the neighborhoods where the city's real machinery operated without the benefit of good lighting or charitable galas. The Alderman Club on Wabash was a private establishment that had existed in various forms since the 1940s, a place where the city's parallel power structures had always found neutral ground. The manager, a small, careful man named Ostrowski, met them at the back entrance without surprise. "Private room is ready," Ostrowski said. "Your guests arrived 8 minutes ago." "How many?" Marcus said. "5, as agreed, plus Mr. Caruso." Ronan nodded. He looked at Serafina once. She was looking at the door. They went in. The private room was wood-paneled and low-lit, with a rectangular table and 8 chairs, and the specific atmosphere of a place where difficult things had been said for a very long time. Caruso's 5 men were positioned around the room's perimeter. Caruso himself sat at the far end of the table with his jacket on, and his hands visible, and the expression of a man who had decided before entering the room how the evening would end. He was not prepared for Serafina. She walked in behind Ronan, and he saw it. The fractional widening of Caruso's eyes, the micro-expression of recalculation that a man with better control would have suppressed entirely. He suppressed it quickly, but not quickly enough. Ronan sat. Serafina sat beside him. Marcus and Decker positioned themselves. The room settled into its configuration. Caruso looked at Ronan. "Vale," he said. "Caruso." "The woman has a name," Ronan said. "And a seat at this table. Both of those things are fixed points tonight. We can move on." Caruso looked at Serafina directly. Whatever assessment he was performing, he performed it quickly and arrived at a conclusion that cost him something. Ronan could see it cost him something, some readjustment of a plan that had been calibrated for a specific configuration of power in this room and was now facing a different one. "Miss Moretti," Caruso said. "Mr. Caruso," she said. Her voice was pleasant and entirely without warmth. Caruso looked back at Ronan. He folded his hands on the table. "I'll be direct," Caruso said. "Good. You're exposed. Your East Side alliances are fractured. Your secondary financial architecture is in someone else's hands. Your enforcement chief is in a hospital. The city's watching to see if tonight was a performance or collapse. He paused. I've been building for 4 years. The timing is mine. You know it, and I know it, and everyone in this room knows it. I know it, Ronan said. Caruso blinked. He had expected argument, deflection, the negotiating performance of a man trying to appear stronger than he was. Then we understand each other, Caruso said, recalibrating. We understand the situation, Ronan said. Whether we understand each other is a different question. He leaned forward slightly. Here's what I know. You've been patient and you've been smart and you built something real over 4 years. I respect that. I don't respect what you did this afternoon. Caruso's expression didn't change. The woman on the sidewalk, Ronan said, 2 blocks from her store. That was yours. I don't know what you're... Caruso. Ronan's voice dropped. We are in a private room where nothing that happens is going anywhere. Don't do that. Caruso held the look for a moment. Then he sat back. It was a demonstration, he said, not a threat. It was a threat, Serafina said. Caruso looked at her. She held his gaze with the specific steadiness of someone who has been in rooms like this since childhood and has never found them particularly frightening. You put your man's hand on me, she said, to show Ronan that you could reach me. That's a threat. The fact that it was restrained doesn't change what it was. She paused. I want you to understand something, Mr. Caruso. I spent 5 years building a life specifically to remove myself from the kind of dynamic where people are used as pressure points in other people's arguments. I left a family that operates on exactly that principle because I found it intolerable. Her voice was even and quiet and had the weight of something that had been carried a long time. What you did today brought that dynamic to my door, to my street, to 2 blocks from the place I built. She looked at him steadily. I want you to understand that I take that personally, not strategically, personally. Caruso looked at her for a long moment. And what does that mean? He said, practically. It means that my grandfather's position on the question of your operations in this city is currently mine to influence, and I am currently deciding how to exercise that influence. She tilted her head slightly. You should factor that into whatever you're planning to say next. The room was very quiet. Caruso looked from Serafina to Ronan and back again, and Ronan watched the man perform the same recalculation he had watched many men perform when they encountered a configuration of power they had not anticipated. The specific arithmetic of someone who has been building toward a moment for a long time and has just understood that the moment has different geometry than expected. What do you want? Caruso said. He addressed it to both of them. Ronan spoke. The South Side operations stay yours. The Bridgeport network, the waste management infrastructure, the construction contracts. That's your territory, and I'm not contesting it. He paused. The port contracts and the Halstead storage network stay mine. The East Side family relationships stay mine. What you've spent 4 years building as an alternative offer to those families is withdrawn. That's asking me to dismantle 4 years of... I'm asking you to stop competing for the things you were never going to get, Ronan said. Because here's the reality tonight, Caruso. You thought my exposure was total. It's not. The Moretti alliance is intact, more than intact. You move against me now, you're moving against that alliance. He held the man's gaze. You're not built for that war, neither am I, but I don't have to fight it. You do. Caruso was quiet for a long time. The quiet had a different quality than the preceding silences. It was a man genuinely calculating, not performing calculation, actually doing it, and arriving at numbers that were different from the ones he'd walked in with. Jimmy Park, Caruso said finally. He works for me. What happened today? Was a problem that has been noted, Ronan said, and will not be repeated by anyone. He paused deliberately. Including your people. Caruso looked at the table. He breathed in through his nose and out through his mouth and pressed his hands flat against the wood. The Halstead contracts, he said, 15% below rate for 18 months? That offer still on the table for my South Side operations? Yes, and the East Side families. I'll make the introductions myself. You get the relationship. Secondary, not primary. Secondary is what's available tonight, Ronan said. In 6 months, if you've demonstrated you can work inside a structure rather than against one, we renegotiate. Caruso looked at him. He looked at Serafina. He looked at his hands on the table. All right, he said. He said it the way a man says something when he has decided that the cost of not saying it is higher than the cost of saying it, without grace, without relief, with the flat acceptance of someone who has recalibrated and is already planning the next iteration. All right, Ronan said. They were done in 20 minutes. Caruso left first with his 5 men, and the room emptied around Ronan and Serafina and Marcus and Decker until it was just the 4 of them, and the wood paneling and the low light and the specific atmospheric residue of a room where something has been settled. Marcus looked at Ronan. The servers, Marcus said. The secondary ledger. Vittorio still has them. I know. That's the last open piece. I know. Ronan stood. I'll handle it tomorrow. Marcus nodded. He picked up his coat and looked at Serafina with a brief, genuine respect that Ronan noticed and that Marcus would never articulate, but that Serafina registered with a slight inclination of her head. Then he left. Decker left. Ronan and Serafina were alone in the room. She was looking at the table. At the surface of it, the worn wood, the rings left by 100 years of glasses. Her hands were in her lap, and she was very still in the way she was always still. Not empty, the opposite of empty. A stillness that contained rather than lacked. You're tired, he said. Yes. The car is outside. She didn't move immediately. She looked at the table for another moment. What he said, she said. Caruso. About you being exposed. She looked up. Were you? After the gala tonight, after the apology. In the room, while it was happening, did you feel it? He thought about it honestly. Yes, he said. I felt it the whole time. And you did it anyway. I did it anyway. She looked at him with those dark eyes, and the expression on her face was one he hadn't seen before. Not the careful steadiness of assessment, not the composed control of a woman managing a complicated situation, but something quieter, something that had set down its armor for a moment because the moment seemed to allow it. Thank you, she said. For tonight, all of it. You shouldn't thank me for the apology. That was mine to give. It wasn't a favor. I know. She paused. I meant after. The meeting. Letting me be in the room. You put yourself in the room. You let me stay. He looked at her. Yes, he said. I did. They drove back north through the city. It was past midnight, and Chicago had settled into its night version. Quieter, darker, the streets carrying only the people who had specific reasons to be in them. Ronan sat across from her in the back of the Escalade, and they did not talk for a while, which was not uncomfortable. It was the specific kind of silence that exists between people who have been through something together and don't need to process it out loud. She was looking out her window at the city. My grandfather is going to want a meeting, she said. You and him. Formal. To establish what comes next. I know. He'll want terms, an alliance structure, defined territories, defined obligations. She paused. He'll be fair. He's many things, but he's fair when the foundation is solid. I'll meet with him. She turned from the window and looked at him. You're not going to ask me to be there. It's not my meeting to invite you to. Most men in your position would want me in the room as a softening element. You're not a softening element, he said. You've demonstrated that pretty conclusively over the last 48 hours. Something moved in her face. The corner of her mouth shifted. Not quite a smile. The precursor to one, the thing that happens in a face right before it decides whether to smile. The servers, she said. The secondary ledger. I can get them back. Serafina, I'm not doing it as a favor. I'm doing it because having Vittorio hold your financial records is an ongoing leverage point that makes a genuine alliance structurally unstable. She paused. A real alliance requires both parties to be standing. He understands that. He'll release them if I ask him directly. You'd do that? I'd do that, she said. Tomorrow morning, if you want. He looked at her for a moment. Outside, the city moved past. The neighborhoods, the streetlights, the ordinary machinery of a place that had survived everything that had been decided about it and around it tonight. A bookstore on a tree-lined street, a marble hall, a wood-paneled room. The specific geography of 48 hours that had cost more than either of them had expected to pay. "Yes," he said, "if you're willing." "I'm willing." The Escalade stopped in front of her building. She gathered her coat and her small bag and reached for the door, and then she stopped with her hand on the handle. "The thing you said in the bookstore," she said, without turning. "When you came to apologize and I told you it was damage control." "Yes." "You agreed with me." "You were right." "I know." She paused. "But you came anyway, even knowing I'd see through it. You came in person, which you didn't have to do, and you told me the true reason, which you also didn't have to do." She turned slightly, not fully, her profile caught in the amber of the streetlight through the glass. "That's not nothing." He looked at her profile. At the line of her jaw, the dark hair against the amber light, the specific composure of a woman who had spent 5 years building a life that was genuinely hers and had spent the last 2 days watching it get pulled back into the current she'd swum out of, and who was still here, still standing, still choosing to speak the truth about small things, even when the large things were in motion. "No," he said quietly, "it's not nothing." She got out of the car. He watched her walk to her door and find her key and let herself in without looking back. And the door closed, and the building stood ordinary and narrow on its tree-lined street in Lincoln Square, with its lights and its brickwork and its complete indifference to what had been decided tonight. Cole waited. Ronan sat in the back of the Escalade and looked at the building for a moment longer than necessary. Then, "Office," he said. He had work to do. The morning came gray and cold and genuinely quiet in the way of Chicago mornings when the lake is flat and the wind hasn't started yet. Ronan was at his desk by 7. Marcus arrived at 7:15 with coffee and a legal pad, and the expression of a man who had slept 4 hours and considered it adequate. They worked. The reconstruction of the secondary financial architecture took 2 hours to plan and would take 3 weeks to execute, but the plan existed now and had a timeline, and Diane Chen was already running the numbers on the first phase. The East Coast families, Ricci and Tanner, had both agreed to hold their positions pending confirmation of the Moretti Alliance's posture toward veil operations. One call from Vittorio's office, which came at 9:47 a.m., in the form of a brief message delivered by a man Ronan didn't know, and confirmed in 3 sentences, established that posture clearly. The Moretti family considered the Veil organization a recognized partner in Midwest operations, effective immediately. Within 20 minutes of that call, 2 of the 4 dark locations had checked back in. The server access was restored by noon. Serafina had called her grandfather at 8, and the conversation had apparently been brief, and by 11:30 Marcus was watching the secondary ledger's data restore itself from a backup location that Vittorio had maintained, intact, presumably because he had always intended to return it. The precision of it was, as Serafina had said, terrifying. At 2 in the afternoon, Ronan drove to Lincoln Square. He parked on the street and walked to Clarion Books and pushed the door open, and the small bell announced him, and the smell of the place hit him the same way it had the first time, paper and wood and the faint warmth of coffee from somewhere in the back. She was behind the counter, different sweater, same composure. She looked up when he walked in, and this time there was no cycle of recognition, just the straightforward acknowledgement of someone who had been expecting him. One of the other customers glanced up and then back at their book. Ronan walked to the counter. He put his hands on the edge of the wood and looked at her. "The servers are back," he said. "I know. The Ricci and Tanner relationships are holding. Caruso is contained." He paused. "Jimmy is out of the hospital. He'll be mobile by the weekend." "I'm glad." "The Moretti Alliance is formally established as of this morning." "Also something I know." She leaned on the counter and looked at him with a directness that he was beginning to understand simply how she looked at everything. "Are you here to give me a status report?" "No." "Then why are you here?" He looked at her, at the woman who had faced his contempt in a ballroom and not flinched, who had asked her grandfather not to start a war, who had sat across from Aldo Caruso in a wood-paneled room and taken him apart with a file and a steady voice and no apparent fear, who had handed him his servers back this morning because she'd decided it was the structurally correct thing to do, and who had built this small, genuine, Carefully chosen life 2 blocks from the place she worked because she had looked at what she was born into and decided to be something else. I wanted to see if the store was still standing, he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then something happened to her face. The full version of what had almost happened in the car last night. Not a polished smile, not a social one. Something real and a little tired and a little warm. The smile of a person who has been through something hard and has arrived at the other side and found it habitable. The store, she said, has been standing through considerably worse than 48 hours of organized crime diplomacy. It'll survive. And you? The question was quieter than the others. It was not a status question. They both understood that. She looked at him steadily. I'll survive, she said. I always do. He nodded. He took his hands off the counter. He looked around the store once, at the floor-to-ceiling shelves, the systematic order of it, the 3 customers and their chosen silences, the hand-lettered signs and the reading chair by the window, and the entire small architecture of a life built on exactly what it appeared to be. Then he looked at her again. The alliance meeting with your grandfather, he said. He'll want to set terms this week. Probably Thursday, she said. Are you going to be there? She considered it for exactly as long as it deserved. No, she said. That's his meeting and yours. I'm not a term in someone else's agreement. I know. He paused. I wasn't asking you to be. She looked at him. The question that had not been asked was visible between them. Not the meeting question, the other one. The one that was not about alliances or servers or the city's power structure or the specific geometry of the last 48 hours. He could see her considering whether to address it directly or let it stay in the air where it currently lived. She let it stay. Come back Thursday, she said. After the meeting. Tell me how it went. He held her gaze for a moment. All right, he said. He walked to the door. The small bell sounded as he opened it. Ronan, she said. He turned. She was leaning on the counter with both forearms on the wood, the same position she'd stood in when she'd told him the truth about damage control. She looked at him across the length of the store. The monsters in the dark, she said. The thing I said at the gala. I remember. Real kings know them because they've already faced them. She held his gaze. Not because they're looking for them, because they've looked inward long enough to recognize one. She paused. You did that. In that room last night, in front of the whole city, you looked at one and called it by its name. He stood in the doorway of her store with the cold November air at his back and the bells still ringing faintly above him, and he did not have a response that was adequate to that. So he said nothing, and she seemed to understand that silence correctly because she straightened and picked up her pen and looked back at her order form. He stepped out. The door closed. He stood on the sidewalk in Lincoln Square in the gray morning light and breathed the cold air and let it sit in his lungs for a moment. The cold and the quiet and the specific quality of a city that was still here, still running, still carrying all of its weight and its history and its parallel layers of power and ordinary life stacked on top of each other like the geological record of every decision that had ever been made in it. He had walked into a room 2 nights ago and destroyed a woman in public because he had believed it cost him nothing. He had walked into every room since then carrying the weight of that cost. He did not feel lighter. That was not how this worked. The man he had been at the Harbor Legacy Gala had not disappeared. He was still in there, still capable of the contempt and the calculation and the specific cruelty that power enables. He knew it. He expected he would spend a significant amount of time knowing it. But he had also stood in a marble hall in front of 400 witnesses and bowed his head. And he had sat across from an 81-year-old patriarch and told the truth about why he'd done it. And he had let a woman who owed him nothing put herself in a room with Aldo Caruso and speak for herself, because she was not a pressure point and not a softening element and not a term in someone else's agreement. And she deserved to be in the rooms where her own life was discussed. These were not transformations. They were choices. Small ones. Each of them, each costing something specific and real. But they were his. He walked to the Escalade. He got in. Cole pulled away from the curb and Lincoln Square moved past the windows and gave way to the city. The whole enormous, indifferent, layered city, with its marble halls and its warehouses and its bookstores and its parallel truths running under every surface like water under ice. Office? Cole said. Office, Ronan said. He had work to do. The empire was still standing, different geometry than it had been 72 hours ago, rebuilt from the foundations up in some places, but standing. The Moretti alliance would take months to fully establish, and would require patience he was not naturally inclined toward. The Caruso situation would need continued management. The East Side family relationships needed tending. Jimmy needed time to heal, and then a conversation that had not been fully finished. The financial architecture needed rebuilding. The secondary ledger needed reconciliation. All of it needed his attention, his judgment, his capacity to hold a very large and very complicated structure in his mind and move through it without losing his footing. He was good at that. He had always been good at that. What he had not been good at, what he was beginning to understand as the Escalade moved north through the city's midday traffic, was the understanding that the structure served something, or should. That the point of holding all that weight was not the weight itself, but what it made possible. Not fear. Not the performance of dominance in hotel ballrooms. Something else. He did not have a clean word for it yet. He thought he might have one by Thursday. The city moved around him, enormous and continuing, as it always had and would, carrying its secrets and its alliances and its ordinary lives in all their parallel motion. A bookstore on a tree-lined street. A woman with a pen and an order form and dark eyes that read everything. 2 blocks between the life she'd built and the life she'd left, and the specific courage of someone who had decided every morning for 5 years that the distance between those two things was worth maintaining. The Escalade drove north. Chicago kept its silence, the way cities do, holding everything inside it, waiting to see what the people moving through it would do next.